You're listening to Tune Dig, a conversation between two lifelong friends about the power of music, one album at a time. I'm Cliff Seal.
And I'm Kyle Stapleton. Each episode, we talk about a single album in depth, unpacking it through conversation to understand what makes it worth appreciating, and learning a little bit about life along the way.
If you're listening for the first time because we're covering an artist or a record you love, we promise you'll learn something new or gain a new perspective by the end of the episode.
And if you've stuck with us for multiple episodes, you know by now that you're bound to expand your horizons as we share clear entry points for artists you may never have tried to get into before.
Today we're talking about Little Queen by Heart.
So let's start at an end and work our way back to the beginning.
Open, interior, night. Cliff's been working on a screenplay.
If I wrote one, it would kind of be like this, I guess. You're playing Stairway to Heaven. in front of the remaining
spotlight appears
in front of the remaining live members of Led Zeppelin as they watch you during their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which they think pretty highly of themselves, but I think everyone was pretty agreed that they should be in there. So it's a pretty important moment. All of that already sounds like one of those nightmares where you look out and you see Jimmy Page making eye contact with you.
Who's going to play the biggest song by the literal rock and roll band in their biggest moment of recognition to date? Yet, who would be talented enough and or absolutely out of their gourd enough to even attempt a feat like that, to almost certain failure and ridicule?
I can tell you who wouldn't do it is pretty much anyone Led Zeppelin wouldn't approve of. I feel pretty confident that they were okay with what was happening.
Which I feel confident is 99% of bands in rock and roll who say they love Led Zeppelin would be like, no.
Right. Add like 6 nines after a decimal point for that, and we're getting somewhere near Jimmy Page's general regard for everyone else's guitar playing. And if you're confused by this, there's a whole documentary where he sits in the room with Edge and just stares at him like, how did this happen?
Who gave you a guitar?
But that whole setup like sounds like a nightmare where you make eye contact and you're like, oh, I'm doing it. Oh my God, for the first time in my life, I'm doing something successful. And then you look down and like you're pantsless and you forget the whole song and everything just crumbles and crumbles.
Wait, when did I learn how to play guitar?
Sure. I guess if you were pantsless, your first question would be about your guitar playing and not about figuring out how to get pants on. Because you'd be fine with Pooh Bear at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I guess
covered
could be
by
fine.
A guitar, in fairness.
I guess that depends on where you're holding it, but good point. It all sounds like so ridiculous to talk about because that would be such an affront to one of the largest songs ever to not be able to
TLDR, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Right. And yet there's that video on YouTube of Heart absolutely sticking the landing in a way that not only makes me cry as a general idiot, but was also making all of the members of Led Zeppelin cry in being able to watch their own song, which God knows they've heard that song more than all of us, and all of us have heard that song so many times, right?
Specifically making Robert Plant cry, who was trying so hard to have disdain and not cry. Disdain for the thing happening down there, but also disdain for feeling emotion welling up in himself about it. Such a satisfying mix of feelings in one face.
I have my own feelings about the fact that instead of Nancy playing the solo, they still apparently tossed it to Mike McCready from Pearl Jam, who steps up in that moment. Well, okay. If we had to do a let's split Pearl Jam into parts, I would have a general defense of the guitar playing. So I'm sort of okay with it. But it was...
I'm also in favor of splitting Pearl Jam into parts so they can't be on one stage playing. I want to make a grunge connection later in this episode, but not that one.
But this is like, I feel like a really good vignette, I guess, of the Heart that I think we ought to talk about today. And that like Little Queen, and as we'll talk about, Magazine as well around that time. That moment of them somehow flawlessly executing Stairway to Heaven in the most, high intensity cover situation ever. It draws a direct line back to when these songs like Barracuda and a lot of other ones on this record that feel like they should have taken a lot of people a really long time to put together. And they were just kind of like pumping out jams in the middle of the 70s pretty naturally, based almost entirely at that point on raw talent. And then just like their own songs propelled them. Like there's such a classic and great story, not only of a band moving along by their own power, not necessarily catching a lucky break, just being awesome and sequentially moving up. But also, like, we want to make sure that we're talking about today the Heart that is pre-80s Heart. That could be a conversation for another day, but really specifically going back and talking about Little Queen and the what would have been called hard rock of the 70s.
Let's stop down.
All right.
If you're like us.
I was like, when is he going to stop me?
And you're of the classic rock marathon all holiday weekend radio with your dad ilk, you only know 70s Heart. And even by that token, thanks to our dads, you don't know that much about Heart still. But you also probably don't realize 80s Heart is Heart. I'm specifically thinking about These Dreams. Massive 80s pop jam.
Oh, yeah.
Insert here so that you remember what it is.
These dreams go on when I close my eyes. Every second of the night, I live another life. These dreams that sleep when it's cold outside. Every moment I'm awake.
And you're like, oh my God, that's the same band that did Barracuda?
Well,
Sort of.
mostly.
Same two people at the core of the thing. Cliff is right. That's a whole rabbit hole and a testament to the fact that they have kept evolving over multiple decades. We're not here to talk about any of that shit because God bless it, but not for me. 70s Heart is a capsule unto itself. And specifically, this little artifact is in the classic rock pantheon, but frankly, I feel as qualified to talk about the classic rock pantheon as anyone who wasn't actually alive in the 70s
Fair
could
point.
possibly be. It was the start of our record collections. It is the language that we speak. It
It
our
was definitely our first songs.
it's
period.
our basis for musical understanding in every conceivable way. And yet, this is a band that just like was kind of happening in the background and not at the foreground enough. So I'm glad to be talking about this record today. It's another one of those sleeper picks for me where we picked it, decided to do it, and I was like, all right, that's cool. Filed it away. It's coming up in the middle of the season. And then we started listening to the record, and it was just like, damn. Oh, damn. Oh, damn. And then it just kept like one little thing each little playthrough. And it's short enough that you can play through again and again and again. And now the weather's getting hot. So it's a good time to be thinking about this record and listening to this record. So I hope that you will, as you barrel into summer and hot weather, enjoy this record in the way that we have.
The vibes are very good. The vibes will surprise you. Because Barracuda rips, and we'll talk about it a lot, right? But it's not the tone of the rest of the record, really.
all.
And in fact,
It's a little bit of a pump fake.
you kind of hit a cul-de-sac immediately and turn around and go, we're at Renaissance Festival now by the second track.
You know, it's pretty interesting for the pre-MTV generation because this record was 77. The label put together a mini documentary for this where they like went to the cover photo shoot. They showed them playing to 20,000 people and did like a little 15-minute vignette of some of the new songs. And they were like, Dreamboat Annie was our ocean record.
Our different albums have different topographic situations. The first album is a very ocean album.
Yeah.
Little Queen is a very forest album.
That's true.
And we're doing the next album on the moon.
Of course, a band is going to talk about it like the elements, like your fucking Mastodon.
Man, I would have loved the Captain Planet record when they got around to it. That would have been...
It's the one with These Dreams. That's Heart. Oh. All right. I'm going to leave that in the episode, but let it be known I would edit that in any other circumstance.
I like how you said, I'm going to leave that in. Yeah, we'll talk about this later.
Go wait in the car.
Yeah, and this era specifically it gives us a really good opportunity to bring back up. I know we've talked about when we brought up Led Zeppelin for sure, and probably another record or two that touched on classic rock, but this mid and late 70s time period especially is fun to talk about how all the ideas and concepts were getting bounced around between these bands, because it's really easy to do, for lack of a better term, I think we'll call it like classic rock confirmation bias. Okay. Like you start interpreting, especially for us, man, like first exposure to early bands. Like I think we were talking about the other day, the actual first song I can remember hearing and remembering was Frankenstein by Edgar Winter Group, which is like not a normal place to start a long instrumental record with a synthesizer that sounds like a guitar solo is like, okay, that's my bass line now. But like that shapes so much of what you hear from this time period. Whoever you feel like started the idea, you can then hear 4 other bands do it and you think they're ripping them off.
Right.
Like if you think the Stones came up with everything, I can show you plenty of songs that sound like the Stones, because the Stones wrote songs that sound like everything else. But like you can really easily hear Led Zeppelin in here if you want to. But I think what's cooler to talk about, especially in the context of Little Queen, it's like a lot of these bands were friends bouncing ideas off of each other. And the fact that there's 2 or 3 versions of the same idea, like the fact that Achilles' Last Stand sounds like Barracuda, is not that big of a statement. You found 2 songs that sound similar from exactly the same time period, and they both are sick. Like that's a great idea.
What I love about that in particular, though, is Nancy has explicitly said, I was ripping off a Nazareth song when I did that. But the Nazareth song itself was a cover of a Joni Mitchell song from Blue.
Look out the left, the captain said. The lights down there, that's where we'll land.
Which is like all the best things, like all the layers of heart that you need to know kind of at once, the light and the dark, the heavy and the folky. I think a broader point around context is like things were the literal opposite of the way they are now. There was, you know, save I guess for like some racial overtones culturally, in rock music, there was as close to a monoculture as there's ever been in the history of this country by the mid 70s, right? The Cultural Revolution happens. And that's when Ann and Nancy were growing up in progressive Seattle, right? Where they have all the Cultural Revolution, 68 to 71, pushing the frontiers outward stuff. And then things have kind of crystallized with hard rock and just like the explosion of huge rock bands by the mid 70s. So there's radio rock. It's on all the time. So I think that's where a lot of the exchange happened, is like you go get the 99-cent 45 and you're just playing these songs over and over and learning them and whatever, that kind of thing. And then you're also, this was the peak of the like playing outside at a college football stadium or in a parking lot type days, right? All the stories that our dads told us growing up, where it's like, why don't they do that shit anymore?
Yeah, just orders of magnitude less music to consume overall.
Right.
So that feedback loop was a lot tighter.
That's right.
Like I heard it, I liked it, I got it. Now I have it, now I know it all, now I'm at the show. Yeah.
That's right. And it was a culture of anything that was coming through town at a given time, you're going to go see it. I didn't know until I told my dad that we were going to be recording this episode. He just casually mentioned like, oh, they played Champagne Jam at the Georgia Tech Stadium in 1979, and they played at like 2 PM, and they were like the best band of the day. And Aerosmith played that day, and Santana had played the year before.
Yep, so far that
like,
tracks.
And like Bob Seger also played that
Yes.
day.
Still, yes.
Hey, listen, man. Iggy Pop said Bob Seger was one of the best players he ever saw come out of Detroit.
I mean, I hear it. I'm just saying, if you tell me that Hart performed better that day than Bob Seger did, I believe it.
Yeah.
All right.
It's one of those things that like, I want to go on record as saying you should immerse yourself in the headspace of like how people were consuming this kind of music, what the culture of this kind of music was. The same way that we were talking about Jamaican sound system culture when we were talking about Augustus Pablo. Like, even though this is our culture, this is the culture we grew up in, I still think it merits thinking about what all was going on. And then as part of that, also important to note, heavy macho, very loud, super testosterone driven, all dudes in this culture. There are a lot of women making great music across all genres, definite dearth. Drops off a cliff when you get into the hard rock arena. I could pun somewhat intended.
And that's not a casual, offhand, lazy observation about the time period. Like, everyone who talks about Heart talked about how they stood in sharp contrast to what you're saying. We're not just overgeneralizing. Like, people are like, no, for real, Heart was the first band where, I think in one interview I heard it, that he was saying Heart was definitely the first band where women were making the decisions about what was happening in the band,
right,
and were also the most important parts of the band all at the same time. And in that sense, were the, kind of air quotes, first big woman-fronted band in hard rock, especially.
A lot of the quotes that I read talking about that time, the implication almost seemed to be, oh, we didn't realize there were no chicks on stage, or like really at a lot of these shows.
Yep, I felt
we didn't
that.
realize there wasn't a market for women in a lot of the stuff until just now. Like, this is a thing that could have been happening the whole time.
Like watching somebody fly out your windshield in a car wreck going, I didn't know he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Got it. Understood. Well, okay.
We'll all wear seatbelts from now on.
Next time this time in reality comes back around, we'll do it better. Yeah.
So there's this record, Little Queen. It's their second and half, third record. We'll get into Magazine in a second. But if you've been alive, if you've listened to a classic rock playlist on Spotify, certainly if you are old enough to have listened to terrestrial radio and listened to a classic rock block at any point in your life, you've heard Barracuda, first song on this record, right? We'll come back to that because there is stuff to say about it. What we hadn't done enough of, I don't think, and what has pleasantly surprised me is a couple of things about this record. One, the quality of production.
Yeah.
On all of these songs. Recorded at Mushroom Studios, like Mushroom Labels Studio in Vancouver. Literally carved into the side of the hill. A big live room insulated by cinder blocks. So the way we talked about Sound City for Rage Against the Machine and Queens of the Stone Age, just kind of like a, how did this come to be here and have this amazing, immaculate sound? There's also
some sort of like energy vortex over there.
Yeah, a little bit of that. A little bit of like, why does the beer taste so good in certain parts of Oregon? Because they're using the air there. There's also a board, similarly to Sound City, a tube bass board, right when everything in the late 70s was going to solid state. A 4-channel board, sort of converted into a 16-track board, but tubes, because the person running the studio just really believed that stuff sounded better with tubes. And if you listen to this record, you could make an argument that he wasn't wrong.
In some sense, everyone was objectively correct about everything on this record. For sure. It's unreal how good it sounds still. How well everything stands up today is wild, and we're not the only people to observe that at all.
Yeah. So it's the tubes and the great room and the fact that they came in tight on these songs, and a lot of it is just live playthrough because that was like a philosophical thing. We talked a little bit in the Erykah Badu episode at the top of this season about Russ Elevado and Electric Lady and how he was going for like warm analog 70s sounds. He's never name checked Heart on any of these lists, but the way that acoustic guitar is mic'd on AD 2000 on Mama's Gun, like if you want a whole album of that, then that was the first thing that jumped out at me with Little Queen. It was like, oh, okay, you go to Love Alive right after Barracuda, and the picking on that I liked because it just personally evoked Space Cadet by Caius for me. But it's like, it's the kind of not quite anything picking, right? It's a little bit Zeppelin. It's a little bit Joni Mitchell.
It's the beginning of What I Got without the beat behind it.
Oh, well, I didn't know we were going to be invoking Sublime, but good night, everybody. It's a little bit like Celtic folk. It's a little bit bluesy.
Yeah.
But it's crisp. It's like right there smacking you in the mix. And it sounds so good loud in a way that most acoustic doesn't to me.
It really does sound like you're in one of those guitar rooms at Guitar Center where like all the sounds gotten out of there and it smells like a bunch of guitars. And if anyone is playing, you hear it like it's beside your head. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about the production value other than whether or not you like the songs or you think you like this kind of music. It's worth a good loud playthrough with the best sounding sound system, headphones, whatever that you have access to in your life. This is a good reference tuning EQ record, which I've never heard it referred to as. You know, I don't see it on those lists a lot, but holy shit, does it sound good. Oh my God.
At the very least, one game you can play when you're doing the at least one run through, even if for whatever reason you've never heard this or think it'll be terrible. Hearing it really loud gives you the chance to find all the places where the production flirted with going horribly wrong and somehow didn't points. That's what's so interesting to me about the way that it sounds. It's, yes, somehow kind of immaculately recorded and mastered from like an acoustic guitar point of view. Drums sound great. I don't know why. The bass sounds so great. It's well mixed and all that stuff. But it's interesting in the literal sense because there are places where they will throw an effect or some reverb or some echo or something weird on a single instrument. And I swear to you, if you will listen to some of these, it's like, why does that sound right? Like there are times where it sounds like something like is running through a cheap guitar pedal and they're just kind of guessing what's going to come out the other side. Like the bass is going to run through this thing. And why does that sound right?
Yeah. Nancy said specifically, they don't really remember how they got the tone for Barracuda and has like been trying to replicate it ever since. So it's like one of those little magic moments.
But then also they were mentioning that they did the field recordings themselves for like what was in Sylvan's song and things like that.
And the field recording sounds really good too.
Yeah.
The other one is at the top of Hello, where it's like the carnival thing.
Yeah.
I'm like, why does that sound so good?
I feel like I'm constantly
The
dropping
coins.
quarters in the car.
Yeah.
Every time it happens.
So
like, wait a-
crisp.
Yeah, it feels like a Tom Waits song has accidentally come on my Spotify, which
fucked
would
you
never
up good
happen. Yeah.
doing that record. That one took your brain a little sideways still after all these years.
It's still, even now, it feels
that's
like
your go-to reference for like, that noise shouldn't be there.
just opening a
That's
door.
a bug, not a feature.
Just walking into a room going, what's going on in here? No. No.
Has no one expected these pipes in 20 years?
Are you guys okay?
That's a good sonic contrast where like everything sounds the way it's not supposed to on Rain Dogs and everything sounds exactly the way it's supposed to on Little Queen.
Fair point.
So satisfying.
Like
the whole thing's like ASMR for mixing, kind of. Okay, I found the thing. Mike Flicker produced the first 3 records, and he said, people still ask me why the records sound so good today. I think one of the main reasons was that the board we had was a tube mixing console, which had big transformers and tubes in the boards, which makes everything warm and human, makes the drums and vocals in particular sound bigger and more present. That board came out of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. There were 2 of them, and Al Green got one, and we got the other. It was an old 2 board, which you won't find anywhere anymore. The other thing we used was big 2-inch tape, and for effects, all we had was a real echo chamber. So like dub style. An actual room that you'd send a signal in with a microphone and a speaker. And we had a thing called an EMT plate, which was a plate suspended in the air for reverb. So my point is there wasn't much you could do to mess it up. Today, there's all kinds of processing gear where you run your signal through this and through that. And by the time it gets to the end, it's dead. So the main reason the record sounded so good is it was unadulterated. It was very pure and very basic. Everyone played at the same time. There was very little overdubbing. It was really how he sounded. And I remember Mike Flicker also said in another interview, or maybe in this book, it's called Heart in the Studio by Jake Brown, who's written a ton of books about bands. He said that he basically like pre-mixed it in the room. He got it 90 to 95% of the way there, so that Ann and Nancy, when they came in to listen to playbacks, there weren't really any surprises. The reverb was there, the delay and echo were there. So like when they came back in the room, the vocals in Barracuda already kind of had that space in the mix, which is like not necessarily super normal.
It's hard to explain, but the whole like, why don't we just make this straightforward and make it sound like we sound like thing is exactly how most things sound terrible from that time period. Right. Like it felt like they were doing something straightforward, and it's just, I even heard Anne say in recent interviews how surprised she is about how the songs on Little Queen still stand up, both sonically and as songs themselves. There's some sort of like 2 + 2 = 10 magic stuff, but it's not discernible. You can't, I don't know. Every time I go looking for it, I can't really find it. And it's doubly fascinating because of how this record intersected with Magazine. And so Little Queen is effectively like 50-ish%, 3/4 of an actual record that they wanted to do. But Magazine was supposed to have been, it was planned to be this whole concept record that they were already totally planning out and going in on.
Which was like reaction to the shittiness of the music press at that time, which evoked for me with my favorite band, Skynyrd, the Give Me Back My Bullets and Don't Ask Me No Questions. And there are a lot of songs like that in the 70s that are like, why are you so stupid? Like, why can't you just let us play music and enjoy playing music with our fans? Like, what's the deal with the Fourth Estate? To the point that there are so many songs about it, you got to kind of start to wonder why. Well, you don't really have to wonder if you dig for long why it was so bad in those days, and why is Rolling Stone still in existence and so bad to this day. But that was an interesting thing in the culture at that time. Like, in pursuit of a big monoculture around music, there was a Fourth Estate that was stupid and salacious and generally added no value, except for your friend Robert Christgau, who wrote strange, beatnik, incisive, weird things. The Tom Waits of music criticism, if you will.
He's written so many that there's so many to choose from that I'm sure you could, fill up whatever column you'd be looking to fill up at this point. That dude's written, I don't know how many reviews. But so it's worth, I guess, telling a little quick version of that story just to kind of draw the line, because label fuckery, toxic masculinity, we're covering the hits already on the story, which sucks, but it helps draw.
Good thing that's all over now in the 21st century.
We keep making that joke, and then we keep making this podcast, and then things keep getting worse. So I'm starting to get worried that we're like causing something to happen. Dreamboat Annie has no business being as good as it is in general.
An insanely good debut record.
Yeah, so after this record,
it's got Magic Man, Crazy on You. It's got the song Dreamboat Annie, which is really good.
Right.
It's kind of a concept album-ish thing.
The first, minute and a half of Crazy on You should be enough to convince anybody at this point that this band is worth funding.
And if you've played Guitar Hero on Expert, you don't need to be convinced.
Nancy was playing Guitar Hero on Expert at like 14 or whatever. So they released that record that had no business being that good, and just kind of, were working with indie labels and all of that stuff.
And toured their asses off behind it, like really started gigging after that, toured like 100 gigs within the next year or something like that.
Yeah, got committed to the road for sure. Like that's why it's so great to tell their story, especially from the 70s viewpoint, because their rise to fame, so to speak, was so quick, but so expected relative to their level of talent and hard work put together. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's sort of like wondering how Prince got big. Like, well, if you listen to Prince live for like 30 seconds, you'll clearly see.
Inevitable.
Yeah. Yes, he's the friendly purple Thanos of our life, doing the snaps that make us dance instead of disappear. That was all off the top of my head. You're welcome. So Heart is up in Vancouver, and there's a fun story about them. Basically, you know, they're sisters who want to be in a band together, and they know they're going to do it anyway, and they, you know, spend a year or two pretending that they're not going to do it, wondering if, you know, should I explore other avenues in life?
So they're 4 years apart in age, but after being like cosmically connected through music their whole life, have really vivid and specific stories around the Beatles and seeing them on Ed Sullivan. And the quote that I saw, whereas most girls wanted to marry the Beatles, they wanted to be the Beatles, and like studied their songcraft and really loved Paul McCartney's songwriting in particular. And then that was also married with growing up in a super liberal and open and free musical household, growing up in the like late 60s, early 70s musical revolution. But also interestingly, having parents that got them into Harry Belafonte, Aretha, Peggy Lee, Judy Garland, they cited a lot. And I think when you hear the vocal harmonies on this record, you get that sort of like 30s and 40s songcraft thing. Yeah. They were also exposed to electronic music composers, being in a really progressive place like Seattle. So they have a thousand flowers blooming around them. They have like an effortlessly huge bevy of musical touch points. And the thing that struck me, and we talked about before we started recording, is how straightforward and plain spoken they are about the purity of their love of music and just the way that they talk about everything.
Yeah, Nancy is like the Bob Ross of playing hard rock guitar.
Totally. This weird counterpoint thing is a happy tree to me.
How do you play Crazy on You, Nancy? Well, to be honest with you, I just do this. Don't.
You just pick it up and play. Yeah.
You just move your fingers in a few directions. Yeah.
What was that YouTube comment? Like, she trying to put words to something that she knows from muscle memory.
Yeah. It's always a little bit of a pain once you ask an expert a question and you watch them try to break it down for you, and you realize in real time, like, it's a waste of this person's brain to be trying to break this down like this for me. I'm sorry I asked you.
I could delegate this, but it'd be quicker if I just did it myself.
I award myself no points, and may God have mercy on my soul.
We also talked in the Olivia Rodrigo episode about how clear-headed and articulate she is about her musical ideas from a very young age. So imagine if Olivia Rodrigo was one of the best guitar players and singers like of all time, objectively, in the genre of rock music. And that's kind of what you have here. It's striking when you watch or read interviews with them, how much music they've absorbed, like what pure, real fans they are, and how they match that with a discipline and a talent to want to add their own vocabulary to it. And yes, in essence, I know that's what all music is. You take your influences and you eventually turn them into something that's only you, but they have there's such a poetry to the way that they go about it all. And I think part of that comes from them being both big readers. Like, I also read that who's the younger, is Nancy the younger, was a German lit major when she was briefly in college, and read like Kafka and Dostoevsky. So they're smart. They're very smart and cerebral, and not in an alienating way. Sort of in a different way than I would reckon Tangerine Dream and Edgar Froese to be, where it's very scientific and a little austere. It all starts with that Beatles thing, that songcraft thing. Like, I want to do stuff that people are going to connect with.
Like the early Beatles, especially. One thing you can maybe say about Heart that'll box them in the right way, what they don't have, or what they aren't, they don't have anything urgent to say.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of times...
It's all about the big L, baby. It's all about love.
Yeah, a lot. It's either about love or crying. The songs are not like... These are not Kendrick Lamar lyrics. You know what I'm saying, man? Like, they're pretty straightforward. They're not necessarily proving a point, being agitative. It's not really punk, but there's nothing wrong with it either. Like, the whole interesting bit of it to me is like, there are a lot of sibling bands, sure, right? And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it goes Oasis. Then specifically having like a killer guitarist and a killer vocalist means that they could basically recreate any music that they were listening to really well by the time they would ever want to be able to do that. But I just think it's good to kind of draw out that bit of like, this isn't necessarily the same music where active listening is rewarded by this sort of like nuanced understanding of the underlying like emotion or drive or narrative, or, you know, they say that they had a concept for magazine that never came to be, but like they just didn't have a concept when they decided to then go record Little Queen. Like there was nothing urgent, important, nothing that got carried through.
The concept is we have 3 weeks to get an album on the market to beat a court case.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
But like that's sort of the purity and the magic of the 70s heart to me. That's why it feels like this record has no business being this good. Because like, why did you even make this? It feels like you were born literally to create this type of music with your sister. I don't really know what happened in the decades afterwards. You know, I'm glad they continued to play music if that's what they wanted to do. But this, like the songs that came out of just pure, like, I don't know, 4 people just kind of liked each other. 2 sisters, 2 dudes who for a while were able to live in relative harmony with one another and be in the band together and be in romantic relationships and just like kick ass at every possible opportunity. Every moment they had to succeed, they did because they stepped up to the plate and did it. Like, of courseness of the whole thing is just so ridiculous to me when I think about it. And like that to me is what adds to the whole kind of mystique of the whole thing. Like, it even makes the story of how this record came to be feel almost ridiculous in and of itself, because we can talk about what drove the lyrics behind Barracuda, but like that's the only story like this. There's no other like this situation or this traumatic event led to this. They're just like, we played folk music and liked Joni Mitchell and Led Zeppelin, and this is what we've come up with together. Do you like it? Yes, a lot of people like it. Okay, great. How that story can coexist with it still being a story about a band who was just like pummeled by toxic masculinity inside of this music industry where they just casually became like the foremost female fronted hard rock band who became an inspiration to all these other people. Like, I don't know. It's hard to explain that. To me, like that context helps me listen to this record a little bit better. And we can dive into the story and stuff, but like just the unreasonableness of the moment sort of makes me enjoy the way that this music came out.
Yeah, I think that's why I was so satisfied learning about them growing up, because there's such a purity and a love of music that transcends. They are going to keep making songs and doing it together. It's a magnetic cosmic force between the two of them that almost makes a thing like a court case or a toxic battle with their record label or just the general culture of the boys club of music and business at that time is like, well, yeah, we'll deal with it because we have to. Like, nothing is better or more important than the joy of just being with my sister in the living room, writing kick-ass songs and playing kick-ass songs for people around the world. The rest will sort itself out. It's all just obstacles to jump to get back to doing that thing. Like, of course we would do it. Of course we would. It all smacks of the Johnny Cash, like we'd play faster if we could.
Yeah.
I know I cite that a lot, but I think that's a thing in the artist mentality. Like that's a through line of you got to have that single-mindedness, that determination. And there's so much of that in their lives growing up. It's not an adversity-based thing. They just love it so much.
Yeah, like they'd be more earnest if they needed to.
Yeah.
But they don't.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A lot of this record feels very, at the risk of saying this word because you invoke the band, I don't mean the band. A lot of this record feels very sublime, like the sense of the feeling.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
You should be. Post Malone of the 90s. Bud Light Lime.
You can taste that Bud Light Lime, though, can't you?
You sure can.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. You're drinking it out of a crock, though.
You're wearing a tank top. You smell vaguely of cigarette smoke. Am I skateboarding? When did I learn this? Whose small dog is this running alongside me?
So there are moments throughout the record. Really, that's really a theme of this season. It's like really getting into the active listening, the being present, the finding the holy shit moments. They don't hit you really overtly much on this record because so much of it is folky, nuanced, whatever. The first one that hits me after Barracuda is about 3 minutes in on Love Alive. They start layering the acoustic guitars and vocal harmonies. And you're just like, oh, wow. It's like being outside at a waterfall. You stumble upon a waterfall in the woods. And I kind of wondered, like, I was being reductive about the acoustic guitars thing. I was like, yep, they love Led Zeppelin. They love Zeppelin 3. They're trying to do that kind of whole thing. But there was a quote in that book where Nancy said, yeah, I mean, acoustics are what we learned on. That's our main core instrument. Even when Heart's rocking, there's always an acoustic at the center of it. And I think acoustic guitars are almost holy myself. They're just the coolest instruments in the world. You can do so much with them. They have so much character the way they're made. They're beautiful to look at, to hold in your hand, and they have great voices. So like in Tangerine Dream in Phaedra, when we were talking about, it started with one sound on one sequencer, and then it's like, okay, now you add your thing, now you add your thing. The best answer is normally the simplest. Like all this shit is Occam's razor type stuff, right? There's acoustic guitar in Heart because I just love holding an acoustic guitar in my hands,
Right.
and playing it and the way that it sounds. That's it. That's the whole answer. Not a big contrived formula, whatever. So I think the songs rule and they transcend because it's not like some asshole in some room was like, we need two chicks and they need to be sisters and they need to do hard rock, but with an acoustic guitar.
Yep.
No. That is, at the risk of a pun, that is as from the heart as a thing could possibly be in this world. She also went on to say, this Nancy, all throughout the shifts and arcs of culture, Anne and I always tried to keep our heads above the water as far as championing or being poster girls for the cause of equality of the sexes. We just put our head down and worked hard to change things by showing up and making our mark instead of politicking. I think it's tough enough for anyone artistic, not just women. In the spirit of our music, we always felt powerful and effective as well as tender and vulnerable. That's the duality of Heart. Damn the torpedoes.
Did she say that or did you add that?
No, damn the torpedoes was the end of the quote. Isn't that tight?
Yeah, one takeaway from this episode period is just like every time you wonder, does Nancy rip? Nancy rips.
Nancy rips.
At all opportunities with whatever it is that she's doing. And you must see at least one video of her speaking directly into the camera to get the full feeling of why that's constantly funny. And entertaining, just to watch her be so good at everything, because she really does look like she's the greatest PTA president who's ever existed. Whether she's playing a guitar or talking about how she thinks about guitar or the music, it's just, I'm so glad that reality gave these people a chance to be this band Heart, because it really needed to happen.
Yeah. You know, we mentioned a grunge connection earlier. And you saying the PTA president thing, while a little pejorative, I understand. So they grew up in Seattle, which is like in the 70s was not a den of stuff, didn't make it out of Seattle if it was happening. I mean, Hendrix played there, right, but didn't blow up till he left and went to the UK. So not a hotbed for rock and roll in the transcendent national sense. But it was 20 years later, certainly. And Anne had a house on Capitol Hill that she only very recently sold. And I learned it was like where grunge dudes hung out. Like the guys in Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam just hung out there. And the Wilson sisters were equally devastated when Lane Staley died. And I think that cosmic connection is interesting to me when you get to the last song on the record, Go On Cry. We played it right before we started recording because I was like, butterfly meme, is this a grunge song? Like a weird, it's got a little of the no quarter-y thing, but it's way more minor key than most Zeppelin stuff is. It's super doomy, but it's also got that Pink Floyd Great Gig in the Sky vocal thing. I liked all this record and then had a moment with this song. Like this will go on every cool vibe, whatever playlist for me until the end of time. And we do, now that we're in the 50 episode range, we get the occasional odd pickup, 1, 2, 3 things a season. Björk's Hunter comes to mind. Like stuff that I didn't already really like, and then it sticks to my ribs.
Yep.
It's hard to come by, but it happens. Go On Cry is one of those for me. So I guess if nothing else happens as a result of this episode, I hope everybody who digs classic rock will have a holy shit moment like I did listening to that song real, real loud. Because it's got the quartery thing, and then it goes into the big shuffle thing. And then it goes back into the no quarter thing, and then it kind of like recedes, and then it goes back into Barracuda.
Yeah. Those songs were really tough for me personally because my rubric is overly intellectual. That's why I tried to talk about the weirdness of how obviously great they are, because the last 2 songs are called Cry to Me and Go On Cry. Like, okay, I need more heft, okay? I need more heft than the topic of these 2 songs at the end, but yet 2 things are true. One is the relative simplicity of the lyrical content is like totally betrayed by how great the songs are.
Yeah.
Right? Every single time, which is kind of like a maxim of heart, with maybe the exception of Kick It Out, which is just 1-to-1. And I mean that in good and bad ways.
Kick it out. Come on, kick it out. She said, kick out your mother and drive while you're still alive. Kick it out. Sitting in a bar in the seaside town. Sweet little love, getting high, getting down. The sailors still running along.
Who's the Jesse's Girl guy? Rick Springfield. Kick It Out seems like a Rick Springfield or like Cheap Trick song to me.
Yeah.
It's like you literally kick it out. You kick a leg up and you're just like, oh, if I could leave one off the record, it would be that one. But I'm still like, I'm glad this exists.
This one's so good. Hold on. Let's park the car here for a second. This one's such a good example because even that song, which is just like overly straightforward as a whole, but then you start, even if you try to get a little sarcastic on it, you're like, well, this is just rock and roll by Led Zeppelin. Mm-hmm. It's just their rock and roll. And then you're like, well, okay, so they just had a weird, like, rip off of it. But then you start thinking like, hold on, what's the topic of Led Zeppelin's rock and roll? Hold on, what's the narrative heft of that guy? It's been a long time since I rock and roll. It's been a long time since I did the stroll. Let me get back. Like, it kept throwing my mind in these really fun.
And that's just ripping off Little Richard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I kept going on all these little loops of just like, hold on, they're without being overly serious about it, they're really encapsulating and sort of concentrating, like a lot of that turn from blues rock into boogie period. Mm-hmm. And you don't catch it all because they've got it hidden across this whole record full of like folk songs, which will turn into a Pink Floyd interlude. And only after you get to the end of the interlude will you hear the little like, oh, they're doing a funk vamp now, and now they're done. And like they bury this stuff in here, but it feels like a classic rock time capsule in a way where Heart is equivalent to all those people that they remind you of, if that makes enough sense, right?
I got the sense, and never more clearly than on Treat Me Well, which is the song where you have Anne singing, which is really interesting. It's like a blink and you'll miss it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's Nancy singing.
Right.
Of course
the one
it's not
song where
Anne
Nancy's singing, yeah.
Any other record by any other band, and you have that, you're like, damn, that's good. She's good.
Yeah.
What a great voice. Just not the goat
Yeah.
type thing. I read,
Mariah Carey's sister does a Christmas record. Like, well, damn, no matter how good it is.
yeah, but Mariah Carey's sister is like Kelly Clarkson or something, you know? I read her vocals being compared to Karen Carpenter, which I think is a good comparison.
Yeah, both of them are just are casually great
It's
every
great.
time they open their mouth.
I wrote that it's great in the way that Big Boy is great, but he is in a group with Andre 3000, you know?
Yep.
But the song structure of that is really interesting because no part overstays its welcome. It, like every part's a little too short and they keep cycling back to it. And that's like kind of a quintessential Heart type thing to me, where you're just like, okay.
The winter cold is coming and the fire will soon be burning. So will you treat me well? Oh, well.
Treat Me Well is a microcosm of what you were saying of like, there's a ton packed into small spaces and sort of like Nancy doing vocals on the record. There's a lot of blink and you miss it.
Yeah.
The other thing that is obviously prevalent on the record, but easy to gloss over the whole time is the vocal harmony and the benefit that we get of sibling of blood harmony here.
Blood Harmony is such a tight band name. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you.
Isn't
Okay,
that
go
what they
ahead.
call it when it's relatives?
I had never heard that before, but if so, I don't mind. I'm going to be Googling that domain as soon as we're done.
So there are great moments of it
Yeah.
all over the record. My two favorite ones are on Cry to Me when they say free and it goes into the upper register and just generally like the ethereal background vocals on that song, period.
I ain't laughing. Reach in and get it and set it free. Cry. Come on, cry to me.
And then the title track, which is so funky
Oh, we got to talk about it. Yes.
and so ripping.
This is low key almost the best track on the record to me.
It was for me
Ooh.
until I got to go on Cry.
Yeah.
Like I had a lot of listens through where I like sort of lost steam before the end. And I was like, Little Queen is tight. This is a rhythm and blues song. This is the version of Aerosmith's Last Child that actually should have gotten made.
You'd rather have wine than gin. Know me the finest by your street.
Oh my God. It is a really great realization of what Aerosmith tried to do constantly. Cause it's like, it's funk, it's Pink Floyd. It never like sticks to one idea for too long.
Yeah.
It just casually goes through waves and waves and goes in and out of a Pink Floyd jam basically and comes back out.
They do
like,
psychedelic super, super well.
once again, just having no business casually doing it that well.
Yeah.
Like,
you're talking about the bridge as the Pink
Yeah,
Floyd thing,
oh.
where the energy of it, I guess, sort of goes down, but it's like an up plateau.
Yeah.
They stand up on a plateau.
it feels
for
like
that
halftime and
bridge.
double time at the same time. And like, I've never wanted an
It's
Anne
damn
fronted
cool.
Pink Floyd more
Yeah.
than I do when I listen to that song. But yeah, like just especially playing that one back and going, how do they go from funk to where we end up in this song is, I love it.
I think you have a couple of interesting things happening in the band that lead to a thing like Little Queen. Obviously, they have these dudes in the band who just want to be Zeppelin and Deep Purple. With I mean that with all respect to the men in this band, not trying to do men erasure in the name of the Wilson sisters. But the drummer who I think was their 5th or 6th by the time this rolled around. And by the way, Heart was a whole band before either of the Wilson sisters came along. They were Army, and then they were White Heart, and then they were Heart. So a little bit of a Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac fledgling cover band version thing. Didn't really become Heart until the Wilson sisters came along, one and then the other. But this drummer obviously loves the shit out of John Bonham. Right. So there's the John Bonham who was influenced by Zigaboo from the Meters, and you have the weird shuffle, never do the same fill twice thing. And then you also have like the absorption of so much kind of weird time signature things that you do to try to make
that's what I was going to say. Yes.
Interesting.
Exactly. Their willingness to change time signatures. Like they'll just have these little moments. You hear it for sure on Barracuda because it's right there in the verse, right? But the drummer's willingness to just like, yeah, we'll nail this. We'll just like black dog the shit out of this. And then the fact that the acoustic comes along with it, to your point, is always impressive. It shouldn't work, and it does.
They do turnarounds really interestingly.
Yeah.
So like Little Queen is cool because it's compressed. Like if I had written that song, I would have stretched out Little Queen, and the harmony, that blue note harmony, is like one of my favorite things on the record, where they go,
Little queen, making your passion play, little queen.
and they bend together in harmony.
They do little like Allman Brothers-esque transitions like that to me from time to time.
But they compress it into the last 8th or 16th or whatever.
Yeah.
Where you don't quite get enough of it, which makes it that much more
They never
satisfying.
jam it.
Yeah.
They
They
never
never
jam.
jam on the Little Queen bent note thing.
Yeah.
I know. And that almost makes them like inverted proggy in a way.
Yeah.
Rhythmically, they're very satisfying in that way. And I think it's the weird funk, folk, whatever thing. So the title track is like, I think, one of the coolest things they've ever done. Or like another one of this should be a classic rock staple and it's not enough.
Oh, yeah.
This should be, I mean, you talk about Frankenstein, like put this on a playlist directly next to
100%.
Frankenstein. And you're
Yeah.
like,
Oh, yeah.
this fucking party's going off.
Oh, yeah.
Let me get another beer. I'm going to stay a little longer. Whoever's got the aux is like clearly doing a good thing tonight.
Oh, yeah. No one can rightfully not like Barracuda. Like it's just, I don't know. It's right there alongside everything else. You really have no business taking issue with it. It sounds like AC/DC playing a Blue Oyster Cult song. It's like everything is perfect about it. It sounds great. And it's so simple and easy to play, which was, I always come back to the combination of the way that music was approached then with how relatively little music had been created overall, like means that all these like E minor power chord riffs are just like sitting there, and bands are cranking out these sick songs that we get to remember because no one had just ever written something this basic and crushed it.
It's so sick that this genre of punk existed totally in parallel to actual punk. Like the Ramones are happening doing down strumming in might as well have been another timeline in the multiverse. Somebody wrote about how like the chug songs started to become a thing. So I mentioned the Nazareth Joni Mitchell thing, but somebody was like, also Communication Breakdown, also Children of the Grave. So this is just like a thing that started popping up the way like reggaeton is sort of like a thing in pop music now. Just a move that somebody's like, this is cool. I'm going to do that. So that the borrowing thing that you were talking about, it's like the chug song thing was, I don't know that it ever really like crested into a thing, but it had moments like this. And nobody, with all due respect to Zeppelin and Sabbath, nobody did it better than Barracuda. Like this was that thing perfected. And that's not even the best part of Barracuda to me. I think the riff is amazing. The verses are really cool, and the time thing that you mentioned, but specifically the jam where another band might have tried to put a big solo or like really max it out. They dropped it out and just focused on the rhythm, and the soloing is actually really being done by the bass in that part. Like they're just sort of whammying the guitar effect. I hadn't really listened to the bass line in that part that much, and you kind of got to get it loud to get to it. But it's ripping. It's real ripping.
don't get caught being funky in a 35 mile an hour zone several times on this record for sure. And I like, that's one of my favorite parts about turning it up really loud, because you have to hear it, because it, to the production points that we've made a million times, it's so tightly produced to the kick, especially, and the patterns match the kick so often that you kind of don't catch that bass unless you're actually trying to listen for it.
Yeah.
But it's under there doing its job 100% of the time.
It is really well mixed, and that you're like, I wouldn't change the way this sounds, but I wish it had been a little more obvious to me a little sooner what was happening with the low end on this.
Yeah, for sure. I think a couple of things to help us wrap up, because once again, classic story. How are we ever going to talk about Heart's Little Queen, which was like 3/4 of a record when they really wanted to make magazine, and how are we going to talk about this for an hour? And now there's been no problem doing that whatsoever, and yet there's a million untold stories about the record that came before this magazine, how the record label treated them in response to basically them blowing up and saying, pay me money.
To be clear, we tried to be really purposeful to not make that the episode, because that's not, it is the story of this record. Like, I feel like we've said this a bunch this season too. Like,
Yeah.
The story of this record is not the story of this record. Like with Mama's Gun, like with some of the other things, where it's like, there's a narrative out there. There's one that you can get on the first page of Google search results.
Yep.
It helps inform your understanding of how this music came to be. It is not what you should focus on. Having said that, I do think it is worth saying on the record, here is a little bit about how this music came to be. We'll save you a Google real quick.
Yeah, well, the idea of saving someone a Google just really cracked me up. If anything, we are ruining your Googles on a regular basis every time you listen to this podcast. But yeah, like, there's a lot of stories that go all the way back through magazine that go to what in general happens when women just try to exist and happen to be good at something. And so there's plenty of that story to be told about it. And I actually do mean this unironically. The first bit of the VH1 Behind the Music about Heart does enough of a job of just like, all right, give me the story points and let me get through this. And it all does lead to, yes, Barracuda is about a terrible person asking Anne and Nancy ridiculous things because their record label put an ad in a magazine suggesting that the sisters were lovers.
A full page ad in
Oh my
Rolling
God.
Stone, which is basically like one stop short of a billboard over Hollywood Boulevard in the 70s.
It's so, we need a cringe of cringe word. Like how do I order of magnitude a cringe?
It's in German.
It just, yeah. And I just like, I don't want to exist when I remember that this happened to people. All that's in there. And my point about it is Heart, more maybe than a lot of other records or even artists that we talk about, instead of sending you on a journey with a record where they set you off on something new to think about, something to reflect on, something to, dig into or learn more about or listen to, or like, Heart to me is, in the best sense, a constant mental jukebox of the best 70s music. Because every time I listen to something, no matter whether it's active or passive, no matter which songs I start with, no matter which order I do on Little Queen, it'll make me go, oh man, there's like 15 other songs I want to listen to now. Oh, I totally forgotten about that. Oh yeah, which record is Achilles' Last Stand on? And like, what was next to those songs on that record? Like, and why did the drums sound that way? And it activates every kind of childlike part of our music discovery thing that we get every now and then, where it's like, I can actually realize and actualize on all the benefits of Spotify and like everything being at my fingertips.
It bleeds through from them to us. Like,
Yeah.
It's a record to make you remember how to love music.
Yeah.
And that it's so much simpler than you remember it being. It's like a good reset record. It's a palate cleanser in a way, not in a way that it doesn't have its own taste. Just like, it kills the plaque buildup in your love of music.
Yeah, and like other records and artists from this time frame can do the same thing, but Heart specifically seemed to have a combination of being influential of other bands and not really worrying about whether they were aping other stuff. In opposition to Led Zeppelin, for instance, who was kind of antagonistic towards the whole thing, Heart is just like, yeah, it sounds like that. What is your question? Why wouldn't it sound like that? Doesn't it sound cool to you?
It's
like,
good.
You know
Don't
what I mean?
You love it too?
Yeah.
Yeah. You feel absurd for like invoking intellectual property at all. Like, why would we do that? That's not what music is.
Right. Yeah. And it almost does
You're
give
harshing
you,
the vibe, Todd.
yes, totally. How it gives you that sense of how some of music really does kind of organically rise from a time period and a collection of people and all of that. And how, like, another trail this sent me down was just like, if they were just like super anal about production like Steely Dan, would it just sound like Steely Dan? Like, there was so much in that time where it just feels like people are really playing with this blossoming energy, and we're learning how to channel the purity of blues and folk music. And Heart is a great example of a band that just let that pump through the music directly. And somehow here we are 50 years later on the other side of it going like, I think I connect with the way that you felt when you made this music. Is that right? Like, I feel like I see something or feel something from a time period where people could be a little bit more pure of heart about music and hadn't heard everything under the sun. And it's worth bringing up that feeling because I didn't want to feel that way about this record at all. I certainly didn't want to have any sentimental value or thoughts about it, and honestly was struggling with why again did we pick this particular record in the middle of this season, because we picked some other like really solid hard hitters, and every time I came back to this album at the actual music, it just proved me wrong.
Badass.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win a free vinyl copy of the album we just covered. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter for even more info about the album, including playlists, links to interesting articles and videos, and even some stories that didn't make the episode. Most importantly, though, please support your favorite local record store or concert venue, or buy merch from a band you love. Thanks for listening.